Thank you, and I want to thank the chairman again for holding this important hearing today, and I want to thank all our witnesses. We certainly all have a shared commitment to serving those who have served us, and some of the issues we have seen are a microcosm of what we see more broadly in hospitals. As one whose father sat in a prominent university hospital in 2005, where he had a staph infection induced in the hospital that greatly accelerated his demise, this is of particular concern to me and something I'm aware of the consequences that it happens. A couple of things just at the outset. I think we've heard over and over again, and as I serve on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee as well, and on the Rails Subcommittee, and I live in Connecticut, the importance of a safety culture, because this has to do with human element of any of these technologies, any of these procedures are ultimately going to depend on human beings to implement them. And so we are going to need to create a safety culture at each and every institution, and we also need to, frankly, make it easy for people to do the right thing. And that's to be able to use the technology well for everybody involved in the situation to be able to do the right thing most easily and not force them to adapt to what we think they ought to do, but actually recognize the reality of human behavior. So that being said, I think the best technology in the world, as we will all agree, is not going to do any good if people won't use it properly. So to that end, I wanted to turn to you, Dr. Perl, to talk about how we do currently test technologies, because in order to have appropriate testing, you want to reduce the number of variables, but at the end of the day, we also have to look at human behaviors. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So I probably only recognize one end of that spectrum, but in general, there are different kinds of technologies, and what happens for drugs, for example, may be different than what happens for devices and could be different than some of the disinfectants that are being talked about. And actually, the current technology that's been discussed today, as far as I understand, is somewhat unregulated, and there are no standards. So in general, there is a process that is usually run at the government level where the device or the drug is regulated. What happens in the FDA is a little different than what will happen in, say, the EPA for disinfectants. Once that it goes through that process, then products are generally brought into the marketplace, and commonly people will approach you and say, I have this new device, I'd like you to look at it, or I have this new product, I'd like you to look at it. And then how you approach it will be very different. What I do may be different a little bit than what Dr. Cox does. And we try and look at the technology not only from a safety point of view, but from an infectious risk point of view, from an engineering point of view. And if we think it's interesting, you can either pilot it, or commonly you may say, look, there are some risks and benefits, and we would actually like you to go ahead, we'd like to do a study. And then you try and determine sources of funding to go ahead and do these kinds of studies. Sometimes these are done under the rubric with IRBs and institutional review boards, and sometimes they're actually done as quality projects. So that's in general the process. It's been relatively difficult for us to get funding to test this kind of technology in a much more what I would call rigorous scientific way.
If I could follow up on exactly that point, who currently is funding the research on these technologies, and if you have thoughts about who ought to be, whether we need a dedicated federal funding stream to deal with technologies. Obviously, we do in the drug category. We have separate ones for medical devices. Is this something, given the importance of HAIs, that we ought to be looking at a funding stream dedicated to that in and of itself?
So I think that funding for HAIs has actually been greatly underfunded given its importance. And we really do not have a good home. The NIH will say this is really not our area. They might fund resistance at a very basic science level. The CDC really does not have that much research funding, and what they have is minimal. Traditionally, we haven't gone a lot to the EPA, et cetera. And AHRQ has not been necessarily quite as interested in technologies, but more implementation science. So there's not a good home. And I think that I'm not sure that another infrastructure needs to be created, but certainly there needs to be an infusion into this arena to assure that we are studying things appropriately.
And if I may, could I ask all 5 of you, if I can follow up afterwards, if you have thoughts about just deciding home, I agree with you, it makes no sense to create a new agency. That would be foolish. But someone needs to take ownership of this issue. Clearly, it makes no sense to have no dedicated stream, given the expense, the mortality, the human expense, as well as the cost to our system. Someone needs to wrap their arms around this, take ownership, start developing metrics, and have a funding stream that it gets the respect and resources it deserves. Thank you all very much.